Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 4 of Chapter 3. Mawdood ibn at-Tuntash, 501 to 507 Hijri, that is 1108 to 1113 Common Era. Sharaf ad-Dawlah Mawdood occupies a special place in the history of the jihad against the Crusaders. A number of factors contributed to making his position prominent, the most important of which, undoubtedly, is the early stage at which he appeared. Also crucial was the profound Islamic nature of his character, his complete devotion to achieving the greater aims of the Muslims, his tolerant, just internal policies, his ability on that basis to lead the jihad movement and create some sort of coordination, perhaps for the first time, between all the Islamic forces in the field of jihad, which we do not find in such a crystallized, mature form except during the Artukid and Zangid periods later on. And finally, his success in forcing the Crusaders into a defensive position and his achievement of a number of victories, one of which came in the hills of Tiberias in the heart of Palestine, far from the arena in which the battles between the rulers of Mosul and their enemies had usually taken place. Nonetheless, he was murdered soon after that in the Jami Mosque of Damascus at the hands of vicious enemies of the jihad and resistance movement. The profound grief that enveloped the Muslim masses after his assassination and the sincere words that he spoke just before his martyrdom all confirm the position of Mawdood as one of the Islamic heroes of the wars against the Crusaders and one of the early pioneers of the jihad. Mawdood's first campaign against Edessa in 503 Hijri, that is 1109 Common Era, a few months after taking full control in Mosul, and after receiving instructions from the Seljuk Sultan Muhammad ibn Malik Shah to go ahead and fight the Crusaders, Mawdood began forming an Islamic alliance, which included the Artuki Amir al-Ghazi, the Amir of Mardin, and his Turkmen troops. Suqman al-Qutubi, who was known as the Shah of the Armenians, and a large number of volunteers. This was the first time that such a number of Muslim rulers had come together to fight the Crusaders. Hence, this campaign is regarded as the start of a new era in the fight against the Crusaders, and an important turning point from division and apathy to unity and attack. As soon as the Crusaders in Edessa became aware of the Muslims massing, Baldwin de Bourec sent a messenger to Jerusalem, seeking immediate help from King Baldwin. He did not bother to seek help from Tancred, the ruler of Antioch, because he had doubts about his intentions, thinking that he may have come to some agreement with the Muslims against Edessa. At that time, King Baldwin was besieging Beirut and did not move until he had captured that city. Then he hastened northwards, accompanied by Bertram, the ruler of Tripoli. Near Samosata, he was joined by some Armenian leaders, headed by Kuk Basil, and he reached Edessa at the end of Zulhijjah, that is August. Atabek Mawdood continued to besiege Edessa for 2 months without being able to breach its fortified walls. When he saw the army from Jerusalem approaching at a distance, he lifted the siege and retreated to Haran, according to a precise military plan, where he was joined by Toktigin, the Atabeg of Damascus. King Baldwin decided to pursue the Muslim army, but he had to unite the Crusaders before he could do that. So he summoned Tancred, the ruler of Antioch, and managed to bring about reconciliation between him and the ruler of Edessa. Mawdood retreated some distance, so as to entice the Crusaders to pursue him to a place that was far away from their base, and then surround them after turning suddenly northwards. The pursuit ceased suddenly, and the Crusader alliance disintegrated. A combination of many factors caused the Crusaders to give up the chase and leave the area, the most important of which may be A. King Baldwin received early warning of Mawdood's plan, so he lifted the siege of the citadel of Chinon, northwest of Haran. He had also received a warning from Jerusalem that the Fatimids were moving against Beirut, so he decided to give up the campaign. B. Rumors were circulating among the Crusaders that Redwan, the ruler of Aleppo, was preparing to attack Antioch during its ruler's absence, so Tancred was forced to give up the campaign. C. Based on the king's advice that there was no point in attempting to protect the areas east of the Euphrates, Baldwin told the inhabitants to leave and go to the areas on the right bank. He kept some garrisons in the large fortresses of Edessa and Suruj, and in some of the smaller citadels, and also reinforced their defenses. Mawdood, however, was content to attack the passing Crusaders from the rear and return to Mosul. Mawdood's second campaign against Edessa. The second round came less than 2 years later, as a result of the mobilization called for by a delegation from Aleppo, who came to Baghdad to call for jihad. They did so after seeing the extent to which Redwan was submitting to the Crusaders and the continuous defeats suffered by the Muslims of Syria, as a consequence of which many positions had fallen into enemy hands. The call of the Aleppan delegation motivated the masses and the scholars of Baghdad, and they held a huge demonstration in which they called upon the authorities, the caliphs and sultans, to realize the necessity of proclaiming a jihad and sending armies to halt the Crusaders' march. The caliph hastened to notify the Seljuk Sultan of what had happened, and asked him to pay attention to the matter and hasten to respond to the calls of the Muslims. The Seljuk Sultan issued immediate orders to his governor in Mosul, the Amir Mawdood, telling him to form a new Islamic alliance with his son, King Masood, as commander-in-chief of the Muslims. All the rulers of the Seljuk region, Suqman al-Kubuti, ruler of Khalat, Tabriz and part of Diyarbakir, al-Ghazi al-Artuqi, who sent his son Ayaz as his deputy, the two Kurdish emirs, Ahmadi, ruler of Maragah, and Abdul Hajjah, ruler of Erbil. In addition to some Persian emirs led by Ilkhani and Zangi, the two sons of Bursuk, the emir of Hamadan, gathered under the leadership of Mawdood, the ruler of Mosul. The allied forces began their military operation in Muharram 505 Hijri, that is August 1111 Common Era, by conquering a number of Crusader sites east of the Euphrates. Then they went and besieged Edessa, where the campaign spread panic among the inhabitants. But in fact, it did not change a thing. Edessa wore the Muslims down because of its fortifications and the resilience of its inhabitants, at which point Mawdood decided to cross the Euphrates and attack Turbasal. The Muslim forces hoped to tempt their enemy to cross the Euphrates, thus to get the better of them. But this was a mistake on the Muslims' part, because when they crossed the Euphrates, the Crusaders were able to transfer a large amount of food, weapons and reinforcements to Edessa, which grew strong after it had been weak. It would have fallen into the Muslim hands if they had continued their siege of the city. It was not long before Jocelyn, the ruler of Turbasel, who was under pressure from the Muslim forces, was able to bribe the Kurdish commander Ahmadil, who with his troops formed a large part of the Muslim forces, to withdraw despite the objections of all the other leaders. Soon after that, Radwan asked Mawdood for help and summoned his troops to Aleppo so that they could work together from there against the Crusaders. Mawdood left Turbasel and headed for Aleppo at the head of his forces, but he did not get far from Turbasel before Jocelyn came out, leading his knights, and was able to attack the Muslim rearguard, killing nearly 1,000 men and returning home laden with booty. Radwan's call to Mawdood was not genuine. Hardly had the Muslim forces drawn close to Aleppo, then he shut the city gates in their faces and took precautions to prevent any demonstrations by ordering the arrest of many prominent figures in the city, whom he took as hostages. Mawdood had no option but to lead his army south to Shaizar, after raiding a number of Crusader sites in the north. In Shaizar he met with Tughtagin, who was heading towards Baghdad to seek help in taking back Tripoli. But he was afraid that Damascus would be taken from him, so he had started to negotiate with the Crusaders in secret. As for Tancred, who had camped in front of Shaizar, he retreated to Afamia and sent word to King Baldwin asking him for help. The latter responded and sent for all the knights in the Crusader East to join him, and he was joined by a larger number of them. Tancred also asked his followers from all parts of Antioch for help. Mawdood fortified himself behind the walls of Shaizar before the gathering of Crusaders, which grew to 16,000 fighters led by the king of Jerusalem and the rulers of Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, was complete. Mawdood refused to be dragged by his enemies into a decisive battle. Tughtagin did not want to offer him help until after Mawdood promised to go ahead with his campaign to the south to fight the Crusaders in Palestine, in spite of the riskiness of this attempt from a military viewpoint. The Kurdish commander Bursuk fell ill and wanted to return to his country, and Suthman died suddenly, so his troops withdrew northward, carrying his corpse with them. Ahmadil hastened to withdraw his troops in an attempt to capture some of Suthman's possessions. Mawdood was no longer able to launch an attack as the numbers of his troops were diminishing daily, and he did not want to spend the winter far from Mosul, so he returned there. This poor conduct on the part of some of the commanders had a direct impact on the possibility of achieving a decisive victory against the Crusaders, like that achieved by Jakarmish and Suthman in the Battle of Al-Baligh. These events demonstrated the extent of the Muslim division and lack of unity, at a time when Crusader forces had gathered in the north and south of Syria, and Baldwin, king of Jerusalem, had achieved a kind of leadership over all the other Crusader rulers. The policies of Radwan in the Emirate of Aleppo were all dreadful. He made a deal with the Ismailis and Crusaders, forming an alliance with them against their Muslim opponents. He joined forces with the Crusader ruler of Antioch against the ruler of Mosul, Jawali, in 501 Hijri, and when Mawdood, Amir of Mosul, attacked Antioch and Turbasel, Radwan refused to help him and shut the city gates of Aleppo in his face. Instead, he formed an alliance with Tancred, ruler of Antioch, against the Mujahideen, and the gates of the city remained closed to the Muslim army for 17 days. Despite this, the Crusaders did not show any appreciation for his stance, as they besieged Aleppo in 504 Hijri, intensifying the siege until its inhabitants were forced to eat carrion and leaves, and they imposed upon Radwan the payment of an annual tribute. The deviant, heretical Rafidi, Batini Ismailis attained a prominent position in Aleppo, as Radwan embraced their ideas and helped them, then used them to assassinate his political opponents. he was inclined towards the Fatimids, and prayers for al-Mustali, the Fatimid Caliph, and his vizier al-Afdal were offered in the Friday sermons in his land, and continued for 2 years in Aleppo. His conduct was deplorable. He brought the Batinis close to him and established a propagation center for them in Aleppo, so that their numbers increased. He died in 507 Hijri. The historian Abul Mahasin described Radwan in the following terms. He was stingy and miserly, badly behaved, with no mercy in his heart towards his people. The Franks would raid and take prisoners, and he would not go out to confront them. Radwan was succeeded by his son Alp Arsalan, who was known as Al-Akhras, the Mute, who persecuted the Ismailis and killed their leader, Abu Tahir as-Saigh, and the other leaders of that sect. Mawdood's third campaign against Edessa. Although Mawdood found himself alone in the jihad movement, he nevertheless launched a sudden attack against Edessa in Dhul-Qa'dah 505 Hijri, that is March 1112 Common Era, and besieged it. The city withstood the siege, so he decided to leave a military force around the city and attack Suruj in Muharram 506 Hijri, that is August 1112 Common Era, because it was the second Crusader fortress east of the Euphrates. With this military plan, Mawdood divided his forces and weakened them, abandoning his cautious approach regarding the Crusaders. The outcome was that Jocelyn, ruler of Turbessel, caught up with him and defeated him, killing a large number of his men, so he had no choice but to retreat towards Edessa. However, Jocelyn got there first to help Baldwin de Bourac defend it. Whilst these events were going on, the Armenians in Edessa conspired against Baldwin and contacted Mawdood to rescue them from Crusader rule, agreeing to help him to capture a citadel that controlled the eastern sector of the city, which would then enable him to capture the entire city with ease. The rapid arrival of Jocelyn prevented any implementation of this agreement. However, the Muslims were driven back and did not manage to wrest the city from the hands of the Crusaders. Mawdood's campaign, the Battle of Sannabra. Mawdood still clung to the idea of jihad against the Crusaders. This was the mission that the Seljuk Sultan Muhammad had entrusted to him as his representative in Mesopotamia and Syria. At the beginning of 507 Hijri, that is June 1113 Common Era, he moved at the head of an Islamic alliance to fight the Crusaders in Jerusalem. In response to the call for help from Tughtagin the Atabeg of Damascus, after his emirate was subjected to fierce attacks from the Crusaders of Jerusalem, who went through the valley of Taim to the Bika and reached Baalbek. Tamerk, the ruler of Sinjar and Ayaz ibn il-Ghazi, the emir of Mardin, joined this alliance. The goal of the Muslims was the region of Palestine, and they succeeded in drawing out King Baldwin to the lands around Damascus as far as the bridge of Sannabra, which is located at the headwaters of the river Jordan. On the 13th of Muharram, they met in a battle which ended in victory for the Muslims and dealt a crushing blow to the Crusaders. The king of Jerusalem went back to Tiberias, and soon Roger of Antioch and Pons of Tripoli came to help him, whereas the ruler of Edessa could not come because his principality needed to be guarded constantly. After the battle, the Muslims progressed as far as Tiberias, but they did not want to venture into confronting the Crusader alliance, especially since winter had begun, so they decided to withdraw to Damascus. That was the first time that Mosul and Damascus cooperated in fighting the Crusaders in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Atabeg Mawdood played an important role in that. He restored the Muslims' self-confidence. So they turned their strategy towards the Crusaders from a defensive one to an offensive one. He crystallized the idea of unity among Muslims and gave it a political and a military dimension, so their leaders became ready to cooperate with commitment and firm intentions. The murder of Mawdood. Mawdood and his allies sent a messenger to the Seljuk Sultan in Isfahan, telling him the good news of the victories that they had achieved, and sending some booty with the messenger, along with some of the Frankish prisoners and the heads of some of the slain. However, the fact that the Muslims were far from their homelands, had no supplies, and were suffering from the intense cold, forced them to cease operations in the area and return to Damascus on the 21st of Rabiul Awwal, with hopes of returning to fight the Crusaders when spring came. After Mawdood received the Sultan's response to his message and his instructions concerning it, he went to the Jamia Mosque in Damascus on a Friday in Rabiul Awwal to pray there with Tukhtagin. When they had finished praying, Mawdood came out to the courtyard of the mosque, holding Tukhtagin's hand, and a Batini heretic leapt on him and struck him, inflicting 4 wounds. The Batini was captured, and his head was taken, but no one recognized him, so it was burned. Mawdood had been fasting, and he was carried to the house of Tukhtagin, who urged him strongly to break his fast, but he refused, saying, "I do not want to meet Allah except fasting." And he died that day. May Allah have mercy on him. The Muslims were saddened by the fall of one of the greatest heroes of jihad, who was known for his sincerity, devotion, and daring, and they grieved deeply for his sudden disappearance after the great victory that he and his allies had achieved in the heart of Crusader territory. The masses of Damascus expressed their sorrow and anger, and the city witnessed turmoil such as had not been seen in a long time. Nothing calmed the people down except their hope that their leader would survive the wounds that had been inflicted on him, but as soon as they heard of his martyrdom a few hours later, their anguish and turmoil were renewed. The Frankish king in Jerusalem wrote a letter to Tukhtagin in which he said, "The nation that murdered its leader on its feast day, in its house of worship, deserves to be destroyed by God." Nevertheless, the Frankish king and other Crusader leaders were unaware, or deliberately ignored what was really going on at that time. The greatest help to them and the greatest danger to every Muslim attempt to fight them was not the nation that they thought had killed its leader in its house of worship, and we know the attitude of this nation towards the murder of its Mujahid hero. Rather, it was that hateful Rafidi Batini group, which was based on unorthodox beliefs and had a strong inclination towards destructiveness, which was established in Persia by a man called Al-Hasan ibn Asabah, whom we have discussed previously. He was supported by the Rafidi Batini Fatimid state, and the hatred of these assassins for the Christians was no greater than their hatred for the Sunni Muslims. What we see today is the best evidence of that. Consequences of the campaigns led by Mawdood. Despite the failure that befell the campaigns of Mawdood, the hero of Islam, they led to many important consequences for the course of the Islamic Jihad movement against the Crusaders, which may be summed up as follows. A. Mawdood's reign, although it was short, is regarded as a turning point in the history of the Muslim-Christian conflict during that early stage, as the idea of jihad became a reality, and found a loyal knight who carried its banner for nearly half of the period during which he was the Emir of Mosul. B. The campaign of Mawdood exposed the weakness of the Muslim forces in Syria and Mesopotamia, and the apathy among some of them towards jihad against the Crusader invaders. C. It is possible to regard the campaigns of Mawdood as a precursor to the campaigns of Imad ad-Din Zangi, without minimizing the chronological difference of 3 decades that separated the achievements of each of them, which then led to the fall of the Crusader Principality of Edessa in 539 Hijri, that is 1144 Common Era. Mawdood directed his early campaign against Edessa and Turbasel and worked to wear down their populace in a way which we would say paved the way for Zangi's efforts against Edessa, for the progress of jihad is connected with one leader paving the way for another. D. Despite the pioneering role played by Mawdood, we find that some historians think that Imad ad-Din Zangi was the one who laid the foundation for the jihad movement against the Crusaders. This is enormously unfair to the role of that Seljuk leader. In reality, the historians who recorded that stage in the history of the Islamic-Christian conflict were dazzled by the extent of what Imad ad-Din al-Zangi achieved in causing the fall of the first Crusader principality to be established in the region, and they imagined that the previous stages were of no great importance, despite the fact that they had truly laid the foundations for the achievements of 1144 Common Era, that is 539 Hijri. We should not overlook the fact that the effective, successful political propaganda that was introduced by the brilliant Iraqi historian Ibn al-Athir in his excellent book about the founder of the Zangid dynasty influenced historians in one way or another in such a way that it made them give Imad ad-Din al-Zangi that status in their evaluation of historical events. It is sufficient pride for Mawdood that he succeeded in striking at the Crusader presence in Galilee, which was an area that had not been reached by any Muslim initiatives for nearly 2 decades. Suffice it to say that he inflicted defeat on the founder of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. E. We may reach a specific conclusion from the fact that the leaders of the Islamic Jihad all complement one another and there is no conflict between them. What Mawdood did benefited the great leader salahaddinalayubi later on. Hence it may be said, today Sannabra, tomorrow Hattin. This is what was proven by the general history of that region in the 6th century Hijri, that is 12th century Common Era. Whatever the case, when we compare the efforts of Mawdood with those who came before him, such as Karboga, Chakarmish, and Jawali Sakawa, it will become clear to us that their roles were gradual and complementary. All that Karboga did was send support to save Antioch. Chakarmish added to that through his alliance with Suqman ibn Artuk in a way that led to victory in the Battle of Haran in 498 Hijri, that is 1104 Common Era. As for Mawdood, his role was more significant in that it led to the defeat of the Crusaders at Sannabra in 507 Hijri, that is 1113 Common Era. This proves to us that in only 9 years, 2 major defeats were inflicted on the Crusaders. But there remains the stubborn fact that the Muslims did not benefit from either victory by attacking the enemy's territory. Achieving swift victory made it hard for the Crusaders to compensate for their losses, but the remaining phenomenon of political division and grudges among the Muslim leadership formed an obstacle to achieving that goal. End of part 4 of chapter 3.